So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the psychological impact of migration. Please know, as an immigrant myself, this comes from my heart. And I hope that what I share will have meaning and have us continue to want to see how all of us can become engaged in us welcoming each other into the lands of the earth and never seeing each other as undesirable. So I'm going to share my screen now and begin my presentation. So I'll be talking about the psychological impact of immigration. We all come at this from different spaces, but we all migrated onto this land at some point historically that had belonged to the native peoples. So I want to acknowledge that. And let me just see if I can get I want to share with you, this is the beautiful land that I left in Jamaica at the age of 16 and have been living here ever since. And so, as we all know, the whole construct of immigration is very, very complex psychologically, because usually we are moving from one place where there is expectable ways in which we have behaved and lived so far, and the environment, into something that at times for some people can be strange and unpredictable. And so for most people who make this journey, no matter how you get here, there is a kind of cultural shock, awakening, and one sense of identity. Who am I? Can become reawakened. For many of us from our adolescence, these are issues we have been thinking about. Psychologically, immigration can be disorienting, and it creates anxieties, and we can even regress to earlier stages of psychological functioning. Maybe for those of us who recently migrated during our in points when we were aware of the immigration, I'm sorry, if we take a moment to just think about when you left one land and you ended up on the other, the kind of psychological adjustments. Of course, immigration creates separation and loss of what our native lands were, loss of previous family and friends, a sense of our historical continuity, and also loss of what, as I mentioned earlier, was expectable and norms and mores, oftentimes expressed through food, music, and language. Unfortunately, immigration can also create trauma, wounds that are experienced in the journey of migration, where one comes face to face with any encounter that threatened one's life, or there was serious injury or any kind of abuse. These are the kind of sum total of how immigration, depending on how we enter and how we exited where we came from, can impact us. So I want to focus a little bit on trauma. And for the many of the folks with whom we work, the reason we are in this space is because of traumas that could have happened. So whether it is pre-migration, and I just shared some information here that for Central American asylees, many experience, over 60%, experience murder or disappearance or kidnap before they decided to make the journey. Then we do know that during the journey of migration, there can be death and threats along the way. And then for some people, when they're in the space of detention. When they're asylee seeking, there can be the traumas that happen in that space. And then certainly if one came with early exposures to adversities, whether it was abuse or neglect or household challenges, experiences before becoming an adult, all of these can compound each other and create varying degrees of traumatic stress responses. And a recent study done by the American Psychiatric Association of asylee in Central Texas in a detention center found alarming rates of mental health conditions. 31% had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, similar amount with depression, and a little less, 11%, had anxiety disorders. So whatever the stress is, and as it is happening during the process of immigration, if the body, the brain is chronically exposed to stressors, the release of cortisol results in dysregulation of certain areas in the brain. The hypothalamic pituitary axis, which creates memory problems, can create problems of regulating one's emotions and executive functioning, and also can impact the amygdala that increases the fear response, making one being very hypervigilant, being hasty to act, being impulsive, because the brain, the prefrontal cortex region of the brain has been interfered with. Chronic stress also results in decrease in serotonin. This is the neurotransmitter in the body that helps to regulate our moods. And then it can also result in decrease of the hormone oxytocin, which is what's responsible for our sense of social joy, empathy, and attachment. All of this can happen, the body becoming dysregulated with chronic stress, the stress of migration, and in particular, if there have been traumatic exposures. This can result in this dysregulation of our brain and our psyche, can result in conditions such as PTSD. I'm not going to get into the clinical diagnosis here, but just be aware that PTSD, very common. There is depression, also very common. I have the symptoms up if you want to look further. Anxiety disorders, and also substance use disorders. We oftentimes don't remember that when one is stressed, one might seek substances to help one feel better, and one can become dysregulated in the use of these substances. So these are all the conditions, mental health conditions, that can result from the trauma and the losses due to immigration. So what are some of the factors in general that influence psychological outcomes? Clearly, if one is migrating temporarily with a known this time and decision to return versus permanent, one is coming permanently to be in a space that is going to impact how one experiences psychologically what is happening. The degree of choice one has in leaving one's country, was it voluntary or did one feel forced to leave? The possibility that one can return to the home country, oftentimes for emotional refueling, that can impact how psychologically we're going to respond to migration. Certainly the age of departure, and following me, Dr. Shervington will be talking a little bit about the specific impact of immigration in kids. Again, the reason one left, was one escaping from something or heading towards something? That impacts how we react psychologically. Also the way in which we're received, if we're welcomed in versus we are seen as undesirable, that is going to impact psychologically how we respond. And also the degree of cultural difference in one's adapted country versus one's home country. And also the extent to which oftentimes for adults, one can continue one's vocation, one's original role in one's home country versus the country to which one is coming. Those are factors that will create the psychological template for how we're going to respond to the experience. So I just want to talk a little bit, some ideas about how we can resolve some of the psychological experiences from migrating, ways in which we can heal, and this depends on the extent to which we've been injured. But certainly at the level of identity, one perhaps is going to have to develop a somewhat hyphenated identity, being somewhat ambivalent towards where one came from and the adopted country. Oftentimes we tend to split them. One is all good, one is all bad. But as we're healing from the separation that happens, the capacity to be ambivalent about both countries. Also, the way in which we manage those fantasies, and I certainly can talk to that, with the feeling of whether the reality versus the fantasy about are we going to return to our country of origin. Many immigrants have this fantasy, or it can become reality, of we'll go home, we'll retire home, or we want to be buried in our home. There are lots of pondering, if only one day, someday. These are things that as we resolve them, whether they remain in the space of fantasy or it's real, it really helps us to manage the discomforts that we can feel as being immigrants. And certainly for those for whom migration is much less of a choice and it is seeking economic or health or physical relief from the conditions in which one was, then the degree to which the services that the immigrant has that are trauma responsive, which I know this is why we're in the space to really talk about how we can create trauma responsive social, legal, and medical services, the extent to which those, if we need any kind of healthcare services, they're culturally appropriate, and the extent to which we can tap into collective and indigenous healing practices. These are all things that are going to help us as immigrants. And again, depending on how we entered and our immigration story, these are all things that help us to psychologically heal and find a space of acceptance with our new land. I just want to share some of the things we've done in terms of collective healing. Many of us who come, especially if we're coming into Western civilizations, carry a lot of indigenous ways that we heal. In New Orleans, after the disaster of Katrina, we tapped into this collectivity at IWES. We created spaces in the community where we erected red tents, where we could bring people together, people who were struggling psychologically from the trauma of the disaster. We could gather and tell stories. We could talk about the traumas we've been through. We could learn from each other how to reframe and think more positively. We could share self-care techniques. And together, collectively, we engaged in calming activities. Collectively, there were spaces for massage, acupuncture, art, and poetry. These were some of the ways that collectively we could heal. And it's interesting that we were referred to oftentimes after the disasters as refugees. And then just want to share a little bit about this new process of Indigenous healing that at IWES we have been in training about. This is from the anthropologist from Brazil, Dr. Alberto Barreto, who has done a lot of this work in the favelas in Brazil. And there's theories behind bringing people together to tell stories of dealing with suffering comes from the theories of Paulo Freire, which underneath the underlying theory is that people can come together, people who've been oppressed systemically can come together. And when they are allowed to maintain their own stories, their personal narratives, how very healing that experience can be. And within that, people share the narratives, they share how they have healed, and they help each other in this collective space. So I am hoping that our being as partners, as friends, with those of you working in New Mexico in immigration, that you can see us as wanting to help to support the ways in which you understand the traumas that have impacted folks, the losses that they've experienced, and the way that organizationally you can support those whom you're working with without creating any undue re-traumatization in your space. And so I just share the various levels of trauma responsiveness that we can have as organizations working with immigrants. We certainly don't want to be trauma-inducing, where we are making the situation worse through being reactive or fragmented in the way we approach our work, but that we want to move towards being more trauma-informed, where we're understanding the language of stress and the traumas and losses that happen in people. We understand the impact that it has. And then as we move to being more trauma responsive and healing, where we're moving towards being a much more reflective organization. We're being collaborative in the ways in which we work, and we center those with whom we are serving. I think I'm getting my 2-minute warning. So again, as organizations, just to remind us how we move towards being trauma responsive. We realize the trauma that's present in our populations. And this is what I try to share with you, that there is going to be some degree of trauma in the immigration journey, that we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. I didn't have enough time to focus in, but I mentioned some of the trauma conditions. We know how to respond. We know how to refer someone if we think that there is a need for deeper intervention. We also are advocating to get rid of the conditions that compound and contribute to people's traumas. And we try to avoid re-traumatizing those whom we serve and those, our internal customers, those who are working with us. And just want to end with Rumi, who says that in generosity and helping others, be like the river, in compassion and grace, be like the sun, in concealing other faults, be like the night, in anger and fury, be like the dead, in modesty and humility, be like the soil, in tolerance, be like the ocean, for either appear as you are or be as you appear. Thanks for allowing me this little space to share with you quickly 20 years of work reduced into 15 minutes. And we're here as an organization to go more deeply around trauma and its impact. So again, thank you. And I look forward to any questions. when we come together in the panel.